Is that why you're here?
The fight beside a man so driven by personal gain and glory is a hard thing, Edward. And I have come to feel the assassins and their creed a more honorable course. Have I been unfair?
No.
The first half of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag fulfills the promise of a pirate fantasy. Edward meets iconic historical characters, and we're treated to light-hearted sequences plundering Spanish vessels and sailing the seven seas as you gain wealth and power in the West Indies. The second half of Assassin's Creed 4 is where the fantasy becomes a horrifying reality. The game's tone shifts immediately in Sequence 6, when Blackbeard is struck down. From there, it's a never-ending spiral for Edward Kenway. He's left stranded on a desert island and forced to murder the only man left with him. He's sent to prison and left to rot in a cage while his friends die around him. His wife passes away during childbirth, making the only motivation Edward has, that of giving his wife a life of luxury, a distant and now lost goal. Edward does lose everything throughout Assassin's Creed 4. His strength, however, lies in his ability to overcome this painful arc of accepting his mistakes and flaws and beginning to better himself as a human being. This reality has been sinking in for Edward across the later chapters of the game, but today I want to talk about one of the smaller moments that define Edward's journey. It's only 2 short scenes, but the subtlety in what is conveyed and the motion capture performances sell you on one of the game's most pivotal decisions. This is the moment that Adewale and Edward part ways. Adewale is the most frequent character you'll see during your time on the Seven Seas. As a quartermaster, he is there every time you board the ship. Even when all this tragedy is befalling Edward around him, you can always count on Adewale to be there at the deck of the Jackdaw at the end of the day by Edward's side. Adewale is not a character with many scenes throughout Assassin's Creed 4, but his character is pivotal to the story, due to his moral goodness. Unlike the Pirates of Nassau, what makes Adewale stand out is his selflessness. A lot of the characters in Black Flag are searching for their freedom, and we see throughout how they feel they will achieve this either through monetary value or influence over others. The Observatory is also an extension of this belief, having control over others and having your freedom stripped away with constant surveillance. Adewale is a character that stands out from the crowd because he is already free. He was once a slave on a plantation, but now is a free man, taking a position as quartermaster on Edward's ship, because the world is still an incredibly dangerous place to navigate as a black man, and Edward's acceptance of him makes the Jackdaw the only safe place in the world for Ade. Because of this, we see that he's a pretty chill guy, and a good friend to Edward, but he has his head screwed on right. Even when Edward is at rock bottom, Ade is by his side throughout. That's why their eventual separation is so hard-hitting. It hurts not because Adewale is abandoning Edward, but because he's doing the right thing by doing it. Leading up to this scene, we have the devastating death of Mary Read at the prison. With her dying words, she only wishes that Edward does not lose sight of what's important in his life, because deep down he is still a good man, and should not fall victim to the wave of death that has befallen the rest of the Pirates of Nassau. Edward, stricken with grief, drinks his sorrows away, and we're treated to a dream sequence that could be a breakdown of its own. However, we're going to jump ahead when Edward wakes up. He is greeted by Adewale. In terms of the pacing of the game, due to Edward being shipwrecked and then his time in prison being so close together, we get a big chunk of time where Adewale is not present in the story. This seems ultimately a necessary decision to keep Edward as far away from the light as possible. This chapter of the story needs to be an emotional gut punch, with no way out in sight for Edward other than to join the fates of his friends. That's why Adewale being the one to wake Edward up just makes so much sense in a literal and metaphorical sense. Adewale represents the good inside of Edward, like an angel on his shoulder, guiding him in the right direction. But it's also so in fitting with Ade's character. He does care for Edward, they've formed quite the bond, and Edward has proven himself to stand up for Ade and care about him in return. Adewale does owe Edward a great deal for saving him from the ship where they first met, but I still feel like Ade would have done this anyway because he recognises the good that Edward still has inside him. In Edward's absence, Ade has taken care of the Jackdaw, which shows a fondness for the vessel that kept him safe for so many years. I also like how chummy and playful Ade is with Edward.
Captain Kenway! You look like a bowl of plum duff.
You can hear in the dialogue and see in the motion capture that Ade is extremely laid back and not taking what could be his and Edward's last interaction together very seriously, and you've seen just how quickly the situation goes from the two going back off on an adventure to Ade leaving Edward for good.
So we set sail. You're leaving?
Aye, Edward, but I have another calling elsewhere.
Ade, listen.
When your heart and your head are ready, visit the assassins. I think you'll understand then.
So why is this scene played so unseriously? You would expect something like a fond goodbye from one of Edward's only surviving friends to be very emotional. After all, isn't Adewale leaving Edward because of his reckless ways? Well, yes, it's undeniable that Ade's chance of surviving the story would have decreased had he stayed a pirate. In history, 25 to 30% of pirates were black, and even then there were Native Americans documented on pirate ships too. Pirates, being seen as the rebels of the time, believed in a world without rules, where all men were equal. Because of this, black men viewed these ships as a haven where they were treated as equals. You may have heard the story of Black Caesar, a slave who escaped captivity only to be recaptured by a slave trader. He then took over his captor's ship, became a pirate, and sailed under Blackbeard, however was killed at the same time as Blackbeard's last stand. Some people believe that Adewale is loosely based on this character, but that's beside the point. What I mean with this tangent is that the pirate ships and the pirate culture were surprisingly progressive for the time, as an act of rebellion against the establishment, so it's perfectly understandable why Adewale would keep the Jackdaw in such good condition, not just for his friend, but because he knows the importance and symbolism that the ship holds especially. This theme of Adewale spreading freedom to others is explored further in the Freedom Cry DLC, a fantastic expansion that I made a video on a few years ago. Getting back to this scene, I feel that Adewale is acting so relaxed around Edward because he knows that Edward's not going to leave in the Jackdaw. He taunts him with the prospect of joining the assassins, as if to say, I hope you're finally going to listen to me now. Edward's relationship with the assassins is exactly what you'd expect from a man with the mentality of a pirate. He sees the similarities in their goals, but ultimately views them as a form of establishment. He rejects their creed at first, even from his first moments in the game, by looting the corpse of Duncan Walpole. It's clear that Edward does not care for the assassins and uses them as a means to an end. However, unlike Arno, it's because Edward is unaware of the tenets the assassins truly follow, and it's his immaturity and unwillingness to listen to them that resulted in him making these negative decisions. However, the assassins were still watching, and Adewale was the right person with the patience to listen to them. How crazy must it have been to play this game for the first time and find out that Adewale was going to join the assassins and Edward wasn't? That's a crazy twist to leave this scene on, and one that makes you question if Edward will follow in his footsteps or not. Of course, he does, and this takes us to the second scene in this interaction, where Edward makes the right choice for the first time in a very long time, and follows Adewale to find the assassins and speak with them. We get an incredibly performed bit of dialogue, where Edward finally acknowledges what he's been doing wrong, his selfishness being his ultimate character flaw, and it's so satisfying to hear him voice this out loud. This is the first victory, even a small one, that Edward has, finally turning the tides on the bad fortune he'd been having up until this point. However, Adewale still needs to put him in his place, seeing firsthand how 6 years have passed since Edward's last visit, and yet the assassin colony is still in ruins.
Jesus, Ade, what the hell happened here?
You happened here, Edward. The damage you caused 6 years ago has not been undone.
Edward then turns the attention to himself and remarks that he mustn't be an easy man to follow, which is just putting it lightly.
To fight beside a man so driven by personal gain and glory is a hard thing, Edward. And I have come to feel the assassins and their creed a more honourable course.
Adewale rightly responds by saying that following a man for so long who is only focused on themselves wears you down after a while, and that Edward's selfish actions couldn't be supported any longer. Adewale had to step out of this comfort zone and think about what he wants to do with his life out from under Edward's shadow. The voice actor for Adewale does a tremendous job here as he raises his voice slightly when he says the assassins are a more honourable cause.
And I have come to feel the assassins and their creed a more honourable course.
You can hear the nervousness in his voice and can tell that this is something Adewale has felt unbeknownst to Edward for quite some time, and he hesitates to tell Edward how he truly feels.
Have I been unfair?
Edward looks away from Adewale immediately after. He's afraid to look at him because he knows what he said was true. And he's left dumbfounded because he's realising that as much as he cared about Ade, he still cared more about himself in the long run, and likely would have allowed him to die alongside the others that already had by his side. This pause allows Adewale to follow up with a question.
Have I been unfair?
No.
You see how quickly Edward responds, despite taking a pause before. He knows what the correct answer is in this scenario, but still can't come to terms with it being true. This prompt from Adewale is the final push that Edward needs. We finally get this incredible speech where Edward confesses to the struggles he's had throughout the story and how he's been led astray.
For years I've been rushing around taking whatever I fancied, not giving a tinker's curse for those I hurt. And yet here I am, with riches and a reputation, feeling no wiser than when I left home. Yet when I turn around, look at the course I've run. There's not a man or woman that I love left standing beside me.
This acceptance is what leads us into the third act of Black Flag's story. Notice the body language here. Edward only looks back at Adewale in glances throughout his speech. He's still nervous to see what Ade's reaction will be to his words. I think the reason he walks around him uncomfortably is that he has all of this energy that he needs to dispel, and walking while talking is a good way for him to multitask here to get the words out that he needs to say. He stares off into the distance because he knows the only person who needs to listen to this is himself. Adewale barely moves during this. He rotates on the spot just to see what Edward is doing, like he knows he doesn't need to intervene. He's well aware that he's said all that he has to. This is the last line Adewale will have in this scene, as Edward's desperation is answered by Atabai, walking into the frame and acting as an extension of Adewale. We know Adewale has chosen the assassins over Edward, so now hearing Atabai be the one to reconcile with Edward is very important at cementing the assassins as being capable, but also the trust that Adewale has in them. He doesn't interrupt Atabai when he walks down the stairs. He doesn't mind that he was interrupted in a private moment, and we can see that he's just as at ease as he was earlier. This is the natural next step, and as Edward walks off with Atabai, we get one last shot of Adewale turning to watch them walk off. I could only describe this expression as sadness, like it's only when Edward isn't looking he can finally show a look of sympathy towards him, and when Ade turns around, it transitions nicely to Edward walking confidently away, like his staging in the scene has shifted from Adewale to Edward as we once again follow Edward's story of redemption. Adewale does show up a few more times before the conclusion of the game, but it's as a member of the Assassins, and definitely very distanced from Edward. That was their last goodbye, and the last time they speak in the game is very transactional.
Captain Woods Rogers survived his wounds. He has since returned to England, shamed and in great debt, but no less a threat.
I will finish that job when I return. You have my word.
The lasting consequences of it is what makes this departure so impactful. Adewale never sets foot on the Jackdaw again. There isn't that scene where he happily returns to Edward. Losing Adewale is the consequence of that version of Edward, and something he'll always have to live with. Now, in Freedom Cry, he will occasionally make references to his time as a pirate, that he had the pirates to thank for the man he was today, and that the skills he learned aboard the Jackdaw were invaluable to him. Another line of dialogue has Adewale reminiscing about the Jackdaw, wondering whether he could find the wreckage, and indeed, in that DLC, you can find the wreck of the Jackdaw during a diving bell mission for a good shot of nostalgia, which is bound to bring any fan a tear to the eye.
The last time I laid eyes on the Jackdaw, I surrendered her back to Kenway and set my mind to leave piracy behind to fight for the assassin cause.
She still holds you under her power.
She was the first ship to accept me as her captain.
It's clear that Adewale cared a lot about Edward and the Jackdaw. The memories he made and the safety and freedom he felt are the kind he spreads to others in his later life, freeing slaves and freedom fighters throughout the events of Freedom Cry. It's a testament to the writing and the performances to deliver such a powerful arc for both Adewale and Edward in a game with such a rich and dynamic cast and limited time to make each one truly stand out, and yet they did it with flying colours. Adewale didn't just save his own life that day, but it looks like Edward's too.
Well, at least until